3,000 men marched into the territory of the most powerful empire on earth. Their commander was not a general. Their army had no siege equipment, no supply chain, no allied reinforcements waiting over any horizon. And when it was over, when the dust settled and the dead were counted and the survivors limped home, the Byzantine Empire had not broken them. What happened at Muta in the summer of 629 AD was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was something history has almost no language for, and the man responsible for it had broken 9 swords by the time it was finished. Every sword shattered on bone and armor and shield and flesh. 9 blades worn to nothing. What does it take to destroy 9 swords? What kind of fighting? What kind of desperation or fury or cold tactical calculation produces that? And why does the answer to that question explain something that military historians are still arguing about 14 centuries later? Most people who know the name Khalid ibn al-Walid know it from the campaigns that came after this. The conquest of Persia, the destruction of the Byzantine army at Yarmouk, the chain of victories so relentless, so complete, that the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab eventually removed him from command because he was becoming more legend than man. But Muta came before all of that. Muta was where the legend was forged, and almost everything people think they know about it is wrong. This was not a heroic last stand. This was not a suicidal charge into a wall of Byzantine steel by men who preferred death to retreat. This was one of the most sophisticated tactical withdrawals in the history of ancient warfare, executed by a man who had been a Muslim for less than a year, commanding an army he had not been appointed to lead, facing an enemy that outnumbered him by ratios that should have made survival mathematically impossible. And he brought them home. Not all of them, not the 3 commanders who died before he even picked up the banner, but the army, the institution, the fighting force that would go on to reshape the entire known world. By the end of this video, you will understand why Muta is not remembered the way it should be. You will understand what Khalid actually did in those final hours, and why it required a mind that was operating several moves ahead of every other commander on that battlefield. You will understand what it cost, and you will understand why a prophet 700 miles away in Medina wept before the news even arrived. Before we go into every flanking maneuver, every fallen banner, every broken blade, and every decision that turned potential annihilation into something close to a miracle, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, not the sanitized version, not the legend stripped of its complexity and its blood, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because this story belongs to everyone, and it deserves to be told properly. That is exactly what we are going to do. The year is 629 AD. In the Byzantine world, it is the 437th year since the birth of Christ, and the empire is exhausted in ways that do not yet show on maps or in administrative records. Emperor Heraclius has just concluded the most devastating war in Byzantine history, a 26-year conflict against the Sassanid Persian Empire that consumed entire provinces, depopulated cities, and brought Constantinople itself to the edge of siege. He won. He won spectacularly in 628, recapturing Jerusalem and forcing Persia into a humiliating peace. But the price of victory had been paid in the one currency empires cannot print: men. The professional military apparatus of the Eastern Roman Empire was depleted, restructured, and stretched across a frontier that had contracted and expanded like a lung through decades of war. Heraclius did not know that a new force was moving in the Arabian Peninsula. Nobody in Constantinople did. The reports that filtered north through the Ghassanid Arab client kingdoms were fragmentary, contradictory, probably dismissed as the usual noise of tribal politics. Arabia was always producing prophets, always producing intertribal violence, always producing movements that burned bright and died before they crossed the desert. What was gathering around the city of Medina looked, from a Byzantine administrator's perspective, like more of the same. It was not. In Medina, the Prophet Muhammad had been building something that had no precedent in Arabia: not just a religion, not just an ideology, an institution, a state structure, a legal framework, a military organization that could translate spiritual conviction into organized political and military power. By 629, this institution had already defeated the Quraysh of Mecca at the Battle of Badr, survived near destruction at Uhud, repelled a confederation of 10,000 at the Battle of the Trench, and negotiated the Treaty of Hudaybiyah with Mecca, which bought breathing room and legitimacy simultaneously. The Muslim community at Medina was no longer a refugee movement. It was a regional power in formation. In the spring of 629, an envoy was sent north. His name was al-Harith ibn Umar, and he carried a letter from the Prophet to the ruler of Busra, a message of invitation of the kind that was being sent to rulers across the region. The letter never arrived. Al-Harith was intercepted at Muta, in the territory controlled by Shurabil ibn Amr al-Ghassani, a Ghassanid Arab leader who answered to Byzantine authority. Killing a messenger was not simply a diplomatic insult in the ancient world. It was a declaration. It was a challenge that could not be ignored, without consequences for every envoy, every diplomatic channel, every future communication the nascent Muslim state would ever attempt to send. The Prophet assembled a force of 3,000 men. In the context of what Medina could field, this was significant. In the context of what they were walking toward, it was almost nothing. 3,000 against an empire whose client kingdoms alone could mobilize forces that dwarfed this number. The intelligence on Byzantine dispositions was imperfect, shaped by the same fragmentary reports that had kept Constantinople ignorant of Medina. What the Muslim army did not know, as they marched north through the Hejaz and into the Syrian steppe, was the scale of what was waiting for them. 3 commanders were appointed in sequence. The first was Zayd ibn Haritha, not a great general by any military calculation, but a man of profound personal significance. He had been the Prophet's adopted son, freed from slavery as a child, raised in the household of the man who was now reshaping Arabia. He was loyal beyond question, respected beyond rank, and appointed to lead not because he was the most militarily gifted man available, but because this mission carried weight that required a specific kind of authority. If Zayd fell, the banner would pass to Jafar ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin, a man who had spent years in Abyssinia leading Muslim refugees in exile, a man with presence, with eloquence, with the kind of personal courage that translated into battlefield charisma. If Jafar fell, it would pass to Abdullah ibn Rawaha, a poet and a fighter, one of the original Ansar who had pledged support to the Muslim mission when it had nothing to offer in return. 3 commanders, appointed in order of succession, as if the Prophet already understood that this road led somewhere that would require all of them. There is a story, recorded in the Sirah, the biographical tradition, that when the commanders were announced and the army began its preparations, Abdullah ibn Rawaha wept. His companions asked him what was wrong. Was he afraid? He said, no. He said he was not weeping from love of the world or hatred of death. He was weeping because God had said in his scripture that there was not one of them who would not pass over hell, and he did not know whether he would be permitted to cross it. The army that marched out of Medina was composed of men who had thought clearly and carefully about dying. That is not fanaticism. That is a very specific and very old kind of courage. They moved north along the trade routes, through Wadi al-Qura, gathering intelligence as they traveled. And somewhere in that journey, the intelligence that arrived back was not what anyone had prepared for. The Byzantine response to the killing of the messenger, and perhaps to the broader assertion of Muslim power that the expedition represented, had been categorical. Heraclius had mobilized. Not a border patrol, not a punitive force, not the usual Ghassanid Arab levy that handled frontier trouble. A full Byzantine military response, combined with the forces of the Arab client kingdoms, was assembling near Muta. The numbers in the traditional accounts are staggering. 100,000, 200,000, figures that modern historians treat with appropriate skepticism, but that convey something real. The Muslim force was outnumbered by a margin that made this not a battle, but an execution scheduled in advance. The army stopped. They debated. Records preserve the content of that debate with the kind of detail that suggests it was remembered by men who were there, who lived with the memory for decades afterward. The straightforward argument was the one any reasonable military mind would make. Send word back to Medina, report the situation, wait for reinforcement or instruction. 3,000 men against a Byzantine army was not courage. It was arithmetic leading to a predetermined conclusion. Abdullah ibn Rawaha stood up. He said something that has been quoted across 14 centuries. He said, "We are not fighting with numbers or strength or equipment. We are fighting for the faith that God has honored us with. One of two goods, either victory or martyrdom." Then he mounted his horse. The army moved. Here is where almost every account of Muta makes its first serious error. The march into battle against overwhelming odds is described as an act of pure faith, disconnected from military thinking. As if the 3,000 men who continued north simply decided that God would handle the tactical problem for them. This is not what the sources actually show when you read them carefully. What Zayd ibn Haritha and the Muslim command structure did in the days before the engagement was tactically rational. They moved to terrain that compressed the Byzantine numerical advantage. They chose a battlefield where the sheer mass of the opposing force could not deploy freely, where cavalry charges had limited room to develop their full momentum, where the engagement could be kept close and brutal rather than sweeping and enveloping. The fighting ground near Muta, in the agricultural margins south of the Dead Sea, was not chosen by accident. It was chosen by commanders who understood that the only way to survive what was coming was to remove the space that made numbers decisive. Need to stop here and correct something that almost every account of this battle gets wrong. The popular narrative frames Muta as a theological event with military coloring. 3 commanders martyred, chaos. Khalid saves the day through a miracle. This framework misrepresents both the military reality and the moral complexity of what happened. Zayd ibn Haritha did not simply charge to his death in some undifferentiated melee of faith and steel. He fought, he commanded. The Muslim line held under conditions that should have shattered it immediately. The battle that preceded Khalid's assumption of command was not a rout. It was a grinding, brutal, sustained engagement against forces that should have been able to end it in the first hour, and did not. Why? Because the ground, the tactics, and the quality of the individual fighters made it impossible for Byzantine mass to be decisive in the way it usually was. This matters because it reframes what Khalid inherited. He did not take command of a broken army in full collapse. He took command of an army that had been fighting at maximum intensity for hours, that had lost 3 of its most important figures in succession. That was physically and emotionally at the edge of what human beings can endure. But that had not broken. The line was still there. The units were still coherent. What was gone was the coherent command structure at the top, and with it the ability to transition from the grinding defensive fighting that had kept them alive to whatever had to come next. Khalid provided that transition. What he did with it is the part that deserves to be studied. He took the banner from the ground where Abdullah ibn Rawaha had fallen. This is reported consistently across sources. He took it, and then he did something that almost no account emphasizes properly. He did not charge. He did not inspire a final assault. He reorganized. In the middle of an ongoing battle, under fire, with an exhausted army that had just watched 3 beloved commanders die in sequence, Khalid ibn al-Walid reorganized the Muslim force. He shifted units. He moved men who had been fighting on one flank to positions on another. He changed the shape of the engagement. The Byzantine command structure, watching from their side of the battlefield, saw formations that had been positioned one way suddenly positioned differently, and they hesitated. Because in ancient warfare, what looked like a reorganization could be the leading edge of a flanking attack. It could be a new force arriving. It could be a trap being set. The hesitation bought time. Time bought survival. Khalid ibn al-Walid had converted to Islam less than a year before this battle. He had, until that conversion, been one of the Quraysh military commanders most responsible for Muslim suffering. He had led the cavalry at Uhud that turned near victory into catastrophic defeat for the Muslims. He knew what the Muslim army looked like in retreat because he had caused it. He knew how Muslim forces organized their flanks because he had attacked those flanks. When he stood on the battlefield at Muta with a broken banner in his hand and an exhausted army behind him, he was not applying faith. He was applying a lifetime of military knowledge. Knowledge of how armies break, of what makes formations collapse, of where the decision points in an engagement actually live. The conversion that made him part of this army did not erase that knowledge. It directed it. The night that followed the first day of fighting is where the story turns. The traditional accounts describe what Khalid did in the darkness between the first and second day, and what they describe is militarily extraordinary. He reorganized the army's formation completely. He moved units that had been on the right flank to the left, and units from the left to the right. He brought men from the rear forward and sent those who had been fighting longest to the back. He created, in the darkness and dust of a Syrian summer night, the impression of a different army. When the Byzantine forces and their Ghassanid allies faced the Muslim line in the morning, they saw a composition they had not seen the day before. Changed positions, changed alignments. The faces that appeared above the shields were different faces. The questions that would have run through the Byzantine command: were these reinforcements? Had fresh troops arrived in the night? Had the engagement they thought they understood just become something else entirely? This is the tactic that deserves a name it has never been given. Khalid used deception not to attack, but to survive. He did not need the Byzantines to think he had reinforcements in order to destroy them. He needed them to think he had reinforcements in order to buy the time and the space to disengage. The goal was never to win the Battle of Mu'tah. The goal was to preserve the army. And to do that, he needed the Byzantine command to be uncertain, not terrified, not routed, just uncertain enough that they would move carefully, rather than with the crushing confidence of a force that knows it has already won. What does it cost to command an army in that situation? Not the mathematics of it, not the tactics, but the physical reality. Khalid ibn al-Walid broke 9 swords at Mu'tah. 9. The sources are consistent on this point, and the Prophet himself reported it, referring to Khalid by the title that would follow him for the rest of his life: Sayf Allah, the sword of God. But the sword of God broke 9 blades before he was done. Think about what that means. To break 9 swords in a single engagement is to be in the kind of fighting where there is no pause, no breath, no moment to step back. You break a blade on a shield and you grab the next one because the next blade is already coming toward you. You break that one on armor and you grab the next because the line behind you is falling and there is nobody else. Khalid was not a general watching from a hill at Mu'tah. He was a man in the dust and the blood, fighting the way you fight when everything around you has already decided to die, and you have decided that it will not be yet. The 10th sword held, a Yemeni blade, reportedly harder steel, different metallurgy, built for exactly the kind of punishment that 9 ordinary blades could not absorb. He was still holding it when the withdrawal began. The withdrawal. This is the thing that Mu'tah actually was, and the thing that makes it remarkable in ways that transcend the martyrdom narrative. Khalid ibn al-Walid extracted 3,000 men, depleted, grieving, exhausted, outnumbered by an order of magnitude, from contact with a Byzantine force that was fully capable of pursuit and destruction. He did it in sequence. He maintained unit cohesion. He covered the withdrawal with enough aggressive posturing that the Byzantine command, still uncertain about what they were actually facing, did not commit to the full pursuit that would have ended the Muslim army on those plains. The men who marched back to Medina were not the remnants of a shattered force. They were a military unit, wounded and diminished but structurally intact, capable of fighting again. Somewhere in the Hijaz, 3 days before the survivors arrived, the Prophet gathered his companions and told them what had happened. He described the battle. He described Zayd taking the banner and fighting until he fell. He described Ja'far taking it and fighting until his hands were cut from his arms and he held it against his chest with his stumps, until they cut him down, 90 wounds in the front of his body, none in his back. He described Abdullah ibn Rawaha taking it and hesitating for a moment. The human moment, the moment of fear that the poet had wept about before they left Medina, and then taking it and fighting until he was gone. He wept. Then he said, after that Khalid took the banner and God gave victory through him. Victory. The word is theologically precise and militarily puzzling. What victory? The army retreated. The dead were left where they fell. The Byzantine forces held the field. By any conventional measure, Mu'tah was a defeat. But the Prophet said victory. And when you understand what Khalid actually accomplished, not the defeat of the Byzantine army, but the survival of the institution that would defeat the Byzantine army 7 years later at Yarmouk, the word becomes exact rather than metaphorical. The victory at Mu'tah was the army. The army came home. The survivors arrived at Medina to something unexpected. They were met not with celebration, but with something closer to reproach. The accounts describe the people of Medina going out to meet the returning force and throwing dust at them, a gesture of contempt in that context for men who had retreated when they should have died. This is one of the most uncomfortable moments in the early Islamic historical record, and it is usually softened or skipped in popular retellings. It should not be skipped. It tells us something true about the relationship between institutional survival and popular perception, between the decision that preserves the force and the decision that satisfies the audience watching from outside it. The Prophet intervened. He told the people to stop. He said these men were not fugitives. They were fighters who would return. The distinction he was drawing was not primarily emotional. It was operational. The soldiers who came back from Mu'tah were the experienced core of a military force that was still forming. They had fought against Byzantine allied forces. They had learned the terrain. They had learned the enemy's tactics, their formation preferences, their cavalry deployment patterns. They were alive. And alive, they were more valuable than dead heroes whose sacrifice inspired nothing forward. There is a detail in the accounts of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib's death that has never left the historical tradition. When they counted his wounds after the battle, counted the wounds of a man who had held a banner against his chest with severed hands, they found 90, all of them in the front of his body, not one in the back. This is the fact that the early Muslim community chose to preserve above almost any other from Mu'tah. And the reason is not sentiment. The reason is that it communicates something about what this army was made of, about what kind of men Khalid inherited command of, about why that army could be reorganized and withdrawn without breaking entirely. They were men who did not turn around. Even Khalid's tactical withdrawal was conducted facing forward, because the men behind him would not have followed a retreat that felt like flight. The aftermath of Mu'tah reshaped the strategic situation in ways that the Byzantine Empire did not immediately understand. The Muslim army had survived contact with a Byzantine allied force that should have destroyed it. This survival sent a signal through the entire region, to the Ghassanid Arab kingdoms that served as Byzantine clients, to the tribal leaders of the Syrian steppe, to the communities that were watching the emerging Muslim state and calculating where the future lay. An army that survives what Mu'tah threw at it is not a border nuisance. It is a force that needs to be taken seriously in a way that changes how you organize your defenses, how you position your client states, how you calculate the cost of continued confrontation. Within a year of Mu'tah, the Muslims would be at the gates of Mecca. Within 2 years, the Prophet would be dead and the Islamic State would face the crisis of succession. Within 5 years, the armies that included the survivors of Mu'tah would be moving into Persia and Syria simultaneously, commanded in part by the man who had broken 9 swords near the Dead Sea. The institutional continuity that Khalid preserved at Mu'tah was not metaphorical, it was literal. The men who crossed into Syria against the Byzantine Empire at Yarmouk in 636 included veterans who had been at Mu'tah. Their experience, their knowledge of Byzantine tactics, their memory of what it felt like to face that kind of overwhelming force and survive it, all of that came home with the army that Khalid brought back. Khalid ibn al-Walid's life after Mu'tah is its own documentary, a cascade of campaigns so relentless that his biographers struggle to keep them in chronological order. The conquest of Arabia during the Ridda Wars, the invasion of Mesopotamia, the battles against the Sassanid Persian Empire at Walaja, at Ulay, at Hira, then the transfer to Syria, the encirclement at Ajnadain, the destruction of the Byzantine army at Yarmouk. He was never defeated in any engagement he personally commanded. The historical record is consistent on this point across sources that have every reason to be skeptical of each other. Christian Byzantine chronicles, Persian records, early Arabic historical tradition. They agree on the fundamental fact that Khalid ibn al-Walid was undefeated. The Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab removed him from command of the Syrian army in the middle of the Yarmouk campaign. He did it because Khalid had become too large, because the Muslim soldiers were beginning to attribute victory to Khalid rather than to God. And the caliph understood that an army's confidence in a single commander creates fragility at the moment that commander is gone. Khalid accepted the removal. He continued to fight as a common soldier for the remainder of the campaign, under the command of Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, and the army won. The Islamic historical tradition preserves this as an example of institutional discipline, the willingness to subordinate personal glory to the requirements of the institution. But it is also, in its way, a tragedy. The greatest battlefield commander the early Islamic world produced died not in battle but in his bed, in Homs or in Medina, depending on which source you follow, reportedly weeping that after all those engagements he had not been granted the death he had sought. Every part of his body bore a scar, he said, and he was dying on a mattress like a camel dies. He was buried, and the world he had helped create continued without him. The Byzantine Empire that had faced him at Mu'tah, that had held the field that day and probably counted it a victory in its ledgers, was gone from Syria within a decade. The Sassanid Persian Empire that had seemed impregnable to every force that had faced it for centuries was gone within 2. The client kingdoms that had thrown dust at the Muslim army's retreating backs were absorbed into a new order that their grandchildren would call simply home. But here is what the victory ledger does not capture. Here is what Mu'tah actually reveals about the cost of the kind of genius that Khalid carried. He fought at Mu'tah on borrowed command, a command he took from the ground because nobody else was left to take it. Because the 3 men appointed above him had poured themselves out into the dust, one after another, and there was a banner lying there, and someone had to pick it up. He broke 9 swords. He reorganized an army in the dark while men were dying. He withdrew in sequence. He brought them home. And when they got home, people threw dust at them. This is the thing that military history struggles to account for. The gap between what a decision costs the person who makes it and what it produces for the institution that benefits from it. Khalid did not become a legend at Mu'tah. He became useful. His talent was converted into institutional survival, and the institution moved on. And the legend came later, from other battles, from the accumulation of victories that followed, from the fact that the army he saved at Mu'tah went on to fight them. The 9 broken swords were left in the Syrian dust. He picked up a Yemeni blade and walked his army home. The prophet named him Sayf Allah, the sword of God. But swords break. They break against shields and armor and bone and the ordinary physics of metal under stress. What does not break, what Khalid understood better than perhaps any other commander of his era, is the institution that wields them. The army, the unit, the collection of trained, experienced, morally committed human beings who know how to fight and have chosen to fight and will fight again tomorrow if you bring them home tonight. At Mu'tah, surrounded by an empire's worth of soldiers, with 3 fallen commanders and 9 broken blades between him and the end of everything, Khalid ibn al-Walid made a choice. He chose the army over the glory. He chose the return over the magnificent last stand. He chose the future over the legend. And in doing so, he made the future possible, a future that his enemies would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand and could not. The 10th sword never broke. He was still holding it when he walked into Medina. History has spent 14 centuries asking what that means. The answer is simpler than the question. He brought it home because he needed it for what came next. That is all. That is everything.